Soulstice is an about 1-year-old hack and slash. The about 18-hour long game was made by Reply Games Studio, published by Modus Games, and started out with moderate ratings around the 70% mark. When I first looked into its trailer, the game's style hooked me immediately, and after it seemed to be very much finished, at least when it comes to the patches, I felt it was my time to take a look at it and answer the question if you should play Soulstice in 2023 or in the future. And, well, let me tell you, this game is a hard one for me.
The seat of the torchbearer.
A so-called tear cracked open the sky over Ilden, one of the three capitals of the Holy Empire, releasing wraith from the void and corrupted all of the city's inhabitants, changing them into mindless zombies or possessed, unholy-looking creatures. The Order of the Ashen Blade sends their Ashen Knights, the so-called Chimeras, warriors that share their body with the ethereal soul of one of their kind, called the Shade, forged and trained by the Order to fight the Void and its corruption. Their task is to investigate the situation in Ilden, steal the tear again, and purge the city on their way through it. One of them are Briar and Lute, an inexperienced hothead rumored to have corrupted blood, accompanied by the Shade of her little sister, outcasts within the organization due to their lack of experience and discipline, and always watched by their assigned observer named Layton, a cynical guy with a pretty sharp tongue behind his mask.
You'd better get used to my witty remarks anyway. Just as I'll have to accept that I'm stuck here with you.
On our journey through the game, we won't just learn what is going on in the city, what the deal with Layton is, and where the tear came from, but we also follow the tracks to the answers of who the sisters are, how they became Ashen Knights in the first place, why we seem to differ from other chimeras, and how all strings are kind of attached to each other. Soulstice offers a mature, often pretty dark story that stands in a heavy contrast to the often heartwarming dynamics between the two sisters, and especially to the younger sister Lute, who is often the literal light in the darkness that surrounds her older sister's soul. Over the course of the game, it was indeed the story that kept me moving forward, and is in my opinion one of the game's bigger strengths. Though I have to say that especially at the beginning of the game, it is hard to follow some of the discussions between the sisters and Layton, when they throw around terms and names that barely get explained, and where the game tries to push you to read the corresponding, but still relatively brief codex entries that are meant to give you a more complete picture, until later part of the game explain things a little bit more in depth. But being a game that stays in this one city and features pretty much just a handful of characters that all revolve around the organization of the Ashen Knights, we don't get to know much about other elements and parts of the world, leaving a lot of room for more to come. And after an ending that still leaves questions open, and seeing how the after credits scene is basically teasing a second part of the game, there is a real chance for this. The world building and visual design of Soulstice is interesting for sure. It is based in more known themes and settings with roots in medieval dark fantasy settings, showing burning harbors, the dirty outskirts of Ilden. We get to see gigantic bridges, city walls, and gothic buildings. But Soulstice mixes all that with a punch of cartooniness in its art design and offers clear influences from other games like Bayonetta, or from anime like Berserk. And at least for the last one, they don't even try to hide that. And that's not just about Briar's Berserk mode, but also includes the artistical integrity of the game's studio to have something like nudity in their game. That's not a big deal in my opinion, but these days I think it's worth to mention that people that get a mental stroke whenever they see a pair of nipples, well, should avoid this game. But for me, this mix was very intriguing throughout the whole game, and underlined with its mostly fitting electronical dubsteppy soundtrack, Soulstice feels in itself pretty unique. And with all of that, the cherry on top are the mostly very well made effects, the animations, and the fully voiced conversations. It's clearly a game that didn't had a AAA budget, but in my opinion does a good job of providing an over-average experience when it comes to its presentation, and I really liked that. and that's where we get to the gameplay, and here the very promising first impression of the game is going to crumble. See, my personal experience with Soulstice went from, okay, cool, give me more, to, please, make it end. And that has many reasons. Soulstice is very similar to games like Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, or even Darksiders. We explore a variety of levels, solve some puzzles here and there, and fight our way through obstacles and the many very interestingly designed enemies. Especially at the beginning, Soulstice feels very familiar if you've played any similar game before, and the game has a solid base here. If you had asked me in the first few hours of the game, when things were still rather basic and new mechanics and enemies get slowly introduced to you, I think I had given this game a clear recommendation. But sadly, the game was not just a handful of hours long, and that's where the issues begin. First of all, let's start here with some of more personal issues that I had with the game, and with that, the button layout. The standard button layout already felt weird and unintuitive, and whenever new mechanics and with them new buttons got added, I often had to rebind things again and again until I was finally happy with it. And to be honest, that rarely happens in other games. Then the game has the tendency to reward people that are good at the game. What sounds reasonable at first glance makes less sense on the second, because our combo meter, as well as the amount of XP crystals that we get for new skills, depends on our performance in fights and how fast we finish levels. Our combo meter fills up depending on how well our combos work, but depletes whenever we get hit. And because our most powerful attacks, the awesome looking combo finishers, as well as Briar's badass unleashed form that enables us for a limited time frame to deal absurd amount of damage in comparison to our normal attacks. Because both are skill gated behind our performance, that makes the fight for people that already struggle with the combat far worse. And when we add the lower amount of skill points to the mix due to the less amount of XP crystals, keeping them from getting similarly strong as a good player, they have to struggle even more the longer they play the game. And especially in relation to Loot's skill tree, where we can adjust our approaches to fights a little bit, they are also more limited in how they want to play the game. And that's in my opinion not a system that makes a lot of sense to me. Not on paper, not in reality. Then let's head over to the more general issues. For one, the midsection of the game feels very stretched, not just because we have a bunch of levels that are neither interesting or add anything to the narrative, but also because of many recycled level structures and assets that we will find on our way through them. I really think that Soulstice could have removed a third of its playtime and it would be an overall better experience. And then the further we go, the game adds more and more annoying things into the mix that only exist to stall time. Like those pylons or the exploding red roots that keep us from destroying many of the crystals that block our way in just one go. These are absolute no-goes in my opinion in an otherwise fast-paced game like Soulstice, and practically only destroy the gameplay flow and increase downtimes between the action and plot progression. Completely unnecessary. Then there is the camera, the biggest challenge you will encounter in Soulstice. The camera usually switches between locked, when we move through the levels for example, and third person whenever we have to fight something. So the level navigation gets worse due to the secrets hidden in the camera's dead angles and harder to guess distances for example, what will cause a lot of frustration in any platforming sequence. And through the third person in fights, we lose any overview over what is happening around and behind us, and makes it a chore to deal with most ranged enemies. Not to mention that everything between the cam and Briar gets just transparent, making the many less clear and distinctly visualized attacks in the game even harder to see, and that is also because the attack indicator doesn't even always work. Then we add the sensibility to walls and roofs to the mix, and the third person fights become way too often an absolutely frustrating mess. But sometimes fights get a locked camera too. For example, whenever the devs felt to prioritize a cinematic look over the actual usability of it. And we end up with a system that might cause many controllers to break. And it's this frustration with the cam alone that is a reason for me to put a big, red, warning sign in front of any purchase button for this game. But of course, that's not it. Because we also have issues with other things, like that animation times of our attacks can be long AF, even longer as some unblockable attacks from enemies, making them hit you inevitably, because also animation cancelling with, for example, dodges is not a thing in Soulstice, what then adds to the fact that our attacks are directionally locked, that the auto-aim system without the lock-on is pretty much just crap, that most combos throw enemies away from Briar, you know, a melee fighter, and so on and so forth. The more I knew about the game and its mechanics, the more I kind of tried to play around those parts of the combat, and that becomes an absolute chore with some enemy group constellations. What then brings us to the weapon system. Different to many other games of this genre, where we usually use 2 or 3 weapons and get stronger and more versatile combos and new tools over time, Soulstice does things different and gives us up to 7 weapons in our hands, but that all have the exact same attack types and combo. Yes, combo. There's just one real button combo in the whole game. Attack, attack, wait, attack, attack, attack. For whatever reason, it was impossible to make combos that use both attack buttons, and of all of them, our main weapon, the sword, has the least amount of moves of all weapons in the game. After we get a new weapon, that's basically all we get for them. And oh boy, once I realized that the combat will feel mostly the same from the beginning to the end of the game, Briar's progress felt pretty bad. So why do we have 7 weapons in the first place? The idea behind that many weapons is that every enemy belongs to one type, and every weapon is stronger or weaker against some of these types. So the idea is to make you switch your secondary weapon depending on the enemies that you're fighting. Sadly, the game does an absolute terrible job at showing you which weapon is good against which enemy and hides the corresponding affinities in different menus. For the enemies, you have to go into your bestiary, where the game tells you in each entry which type they belong to. But only if you have already killed enough of them, making the system basically useless half of the game. And then, if you have found that out, you have to go into Briar's skills menu, where you can see under each weapon separately which types they are strong or weak against. And now you just have to remember all that, because Soulstice doesn't give a damn to communicate or visualize that on a first glance. There are no symbols over the enemies and no clear visual indication. Flying enemy doesn't necessarily count as flying, but maybe as just ferocious or is a summoner. Some enemies look armored, but then don't belong to armored, but are just resilient, and so on and so forth. You get what I mean. And the thing is, you will find yourself really quick just ignoring most of the system altogether. Or at least that's what I did. And I think that's pretty sad, because our main weapon, the sword, transforms itself into the first secondary weapon, a hammer. And I think this is such a cool base idea for more complex weapon overarching transformation combos. But instead, all other weapons are separated and just pop out when we use them and then disappear again. Just imagine our sword would just get new transformations it turns into depending on the combos that we use. Like, for example, using the hammer for single charged up heavy blows, or the sword as our versatile jack of all trades, and then maybe give us something like a scythe or the chainsword that we already have in the game for big AoEs and everything that flies. It feels like there is so much potential that got wasted here, and that's again a bloody shame. And I hope you slowly understand what I meant with the game being bloated. Speaking of which, we have to talk about the color system too. Loot has the ability to create something like an energy field and switch between 2 colors, red and blue, to damage or interact with stuff in the corresponding color. But Loot can overcharge and disappear for a few seconds, taking with her our ability to block attacks or to damage anything that is colored. And the system feels lazy and is just strapped onto the already mediocre combat system, what makes it feel to me like an excuse so the devs didn't have to design actually interesting enemies that force you to play differently, and a combat system that enables you to do that. And that way we just have to switch between colors all the time and deactivate it before loot explodes. It has no real impact or adds any complexity to the game, it's just more button presses. That the color coding of enemies also brings the issue that the transparent light blue ghost enemies are an absolute pain in the ass to see on snowy white bluish ground, and that's super annoying whenever we have to defeat multiple of them in order to kill one of the stronger possessed enemies, that's the red ones. Because if we fail to slay the ghost enemies in time, the possessed enemy, well, just gets possessed again and they get revived. And what can I say? It is indeed a problem when a core gameplay of an hack and slash feels that rough. And actually gets worse the more bloat gets added the further you get in the game. Until you then hit the final hours of the game that turn things around again. A little bit at least. And as I said, it's kind of sad because there is a lot of potential here that they simply were not able to turn into a well-rounded experience. Despite that other games, like the ones I've mentioned at the beginning, already show how things could be done better. That said, despite all my criticism here, that I still think is very much justified, the fights are still acceptable at least, most of the time. And at least at the beginning, I had a lot of fun with them. When the animations, sounds, and enemies still feel fresh to you, and when a game is not that cluttered with bullshit. Maybe it would have been more acceptable when I had to turn down the difficulty later on, so I could just get done with the annoying parts of the game quicker. But even then, all these things would still have made the game less fun over time. And I don't know, I think I'm just disappointed. But hey, luckily Soulstice doesn't have many additional issues. In my playthrough, the game ran pretty well. I had just a handful of occasions where something felt buggy or glitchy, what was usually when the camera did stupid things again, because as I said, that's what the camera does. And also there's no always online or something like an in-game shop. Even when a digital deluxe edition gives you some additional XP crystals, but you would buy that one for the digital soundtrack and the art book and not for the handful of crystals anyway. Therefore, I think Soulstice is at least an honest game, and I respect and appreciate this. As I said at the beginning, this game was really hard to swallow for me, because I went from full excitement mode to the point of where I got literally tired of it, and not even the big titty corrupted angel mummy could make up for this. And believe me, that means something in this case.
I even considered the possibility of saving your worthless lives. But no.
It simply feels too long. How the game uses its camera is most of the time just bad and confused the fuck out of me. The fighting system is weirdly basic while also bloated at the same time and the wrong places. And overall, it's just a very rough experience. And that's why, despite that you can get a key for it for around $5 these days, or on Steam for a minimum of 24, don't. That's why I can give Soulstice in 2023 only a 2 out of 5. Worth the recommendation to keep your hands away, unless you can tolerate all the mentioned issues of the game. But to end on a positive note, I will tell you something weird. I kind of want to play the game again. Not for the gameplay, but for its good parts, its presentation, the over-the-top anime-like sequences, the feeling and atmosphere. And I want to say another thing, if the developers can learn from the feedback and maybe take a look more on how games like Darksiders or Bayonetta are designed, I can wholeheartedly say that I could be very much excited for a sequel of the game, because I like the theme and the setting way too much to not have high hopes for a better second journey with Briar and Lute, or maybe with another Chimera. And if you are still interested in the world and the story of the game, and if you like this genre or the style of it, I still want to encourage you to give Soulstice a chance. But yeah, and that's it. This was my review of Soulstice in 2023. My name, as always, is TechTrack, but just call me Techie. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, don't forget to hit the like button. I very much appreciate that, and it helps me. Subscribe if you want to see more videos like that, and maybe pay me a visit over at my streaming channel Techi's Tavern, or any of the many other platforms I use and which you can find in my card. Until next time, see ya.
You're satisfied now?
No.